The steel blade of the pruning shears snaps against the thick stem of a rosebush, a sharp, clean sound cutting through the damp morning air of the Boston suburbs. At 62, my knees ache when the humidity rolls in off the Atlantic, but I stay crouched in the dirt. My wool sweater is frayed at the cuffs, bleached by the sun and stained with garden soil. Across the gravel driveway sits my 2004 moss green Volvo station wagon. It has rolled past 250,000 miles. The paint is faded, the front bumper has a dent from a careless parking lot tap 10 years ago, and my daughter Serena has begged me to let her buy me a new car every single week for the past 3 years. "Mother, people in your neighborhood are starting to whisper," she told me just last Tuesday, her voice tight with that familiar, polished annoyance. "You look like a retired librarian squatting in $1 million zip code. At least let me put you in a decent crossover." I didn't argue. I just smiled, wiped my hands on my jeans, and told her I liked the way the engine rattles. It keeps me grounded. People see a quiet, weathered widow tending to her garden in a sleepy Boston suburb. They see the frayed sweater, the sensible shoes, and the battered Volvo. They make their assumptions, and I let them. It is profoundly peaceful to be invisible in a world that worships noise. They don't know that 7 years ago, I didn't retire to a quiet life of gardening. I engineered my own vanishing act. For 2 decades, I wasn't Martha, the widow. I was the founder and former chairwoman of Nexus BioHealth Global, a corporate behemoth that designs the very medical infrastructure modern hospitals rely on to keep people breathing. When I walked away, I didn't just step down. I restructured my core holdings into a private family trust, the Nexus Serena Trust, valued conservatively at $4.2 billion, completely off the radar of the Forbes lists, entirely hidden from public ledgers. I didn't build an empire to watch it turn my children into strangers. Or perhaps that is exactly what I was afraid of. My daughter, Serena, inherited my sharp mind and my ambition, wrapped in a designer shell. She is brilliant, fast-moving, and perpetually exhausted by a life she curates for public consumption. And then there's Aaron Cross, my son-in-law of 3 years. Aaron is 38, currently sitting as the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Logistics. On paper, he's a success story, a rising star who climbed through the corporate ranks with ruthless efficiency. What the public doesn't know, what Serena certainly doesn't know, is that Vanguard Logistics is a wholly owned subsidiary buried 3 layers deep within the dark architecture of the Nexus ecosystem. He thinks he won the corporate lottery. He thinks his rise was entirely his own doing. I still remember the exact afternoon he first walked into my home for Sunday dinner, 3 years ago. He stepped through my front door carrying the distinct scent of expensive cologne, Italian leather, and absolute unshakable arrogance. He brought the aggressive pulse of Geneva financial summits straight into my quiet kitchen. When he extended his hand to greet me, he didn't just shake it, he applied a calculated, deliberate pressure, a subtle, lingering squeeze meant to test my grip, to establish dominance over what he perceived as a fragile, elderly woman who happened to be her girlfriend's mother. He looked around my modest, unpretentious living room with a polite, thinly veiled condescension and said the words that have echoed in the back of my mind ever since. "It's a charming place, Martha, truly, but in this world, if you're not moving forward, you're already obsolete." I had smiled back then, poured him a cup of black coffee, and said nothing. He thought he was sizing me up. He had no idea he was standing in the palm of my hand. I let him keep that illusion. After all, youth is loud, and arrogance is noisy, but power prefers the shadows. Every Sunday dinner since then has been a performance. Aaron holding court, reciting his latest corporate acquisitions, treating Serena like a decorative trophy rather than an equal partner, and glancing at me with that patronizing pity reserved for the elderly. He has no idea that every major operational framework Vanguard utilizes requires a clearance level that only my old private office can authorize. He is dancing on a stage that I built, performing for an executive board that answers to my silent nod, entirely unaware that the woman he dismisses as an obsolete widow holds the ultimate leash. Let him play his part for now, because winter always comes for the arrogant.
3 years ago, the CEO seat at Vanguard Logistics opened up across the national grid. To the rest of the corporate world, it appeared to be a high-stakes, wide-open executive search run by top-tier headhunters. To me, it was an open-book test. I didn't sit at the head of the interviewing table like some overbearing tyrant demanding absolute submission. Instead, I set up a fully independent board of directors to act as a transparent public screen, while I sat quietly behind the scenes, reviewing every single confidential candidate report from my home office. When Aaron's portfolio landed on my desk, I read through it 3 distinct times. He possessed the technical chops, the sharp credentials, and a quiet, hungry ambition that large corporations always love to exploit. I personally approved his final placement, but I made sure the structural strings remained firmly wrapped around my fingers, waiting to see how far his ambition would stretch under pressure and how he would handle true corporate power when given the reins. That exact same calculated concealment governed every single detail of their wedding. When Serena and Aaron tied the knot, I intentionally insisted on a small, quiet, private family ceremony. People whispered and wondered why I didn't rent out a grand estate or splash millions across the society pages. My wealthy in-laws, Gerald and Margaret Cross, whispered among themselves about my supposedly modest means and quiet, uneventful life. But I deliberately wanted it that way. I wanted a front-row seat to test a timeless truth. The people who truly hold real power never need to stamp it across their foreheads, and genuine human character should never be measured by the numbers on a bank statement. I wanted to see how Aaron would behave when he genuinely believed he had married down into an ordinary, completely uninfluential family, completely safe from any shadow of real wealth. It didn't take long for his true architecture to reveal itself through clear, undeniable actions rather than empty declarations. I remember a corporate charity gala held 2 years into their marriage. The ballroom was glittering with crystal chandeliers, expensive champagne flutes, and influential investors. As I walked quietly past the edge of the room in a simple, unbranded dress, Aaron was standing in a tight circle with a group of senior regional directors. Without even looking down to realize it was me he was shoving aside, he placed a heavy, dismissive hand on my shoulder, physically nudged me out of the path of his associates, and offered a smooth, practiced laugh to his colleagues. "Oh, excuse me," Aaron said to his partners, not missing a single beat. "Just my wife's mother, a sweet, retired woman who lives quietly out in the suburbs." I didn't flinch. I smoothed down the sleeve of my dress, stepped back into the shadows of the room, and watched how easily he traded away basic human respect just to polish his corporate image in front of strangers who meant nothing in the grand scheme of life. At home, the performance continued behind closed doors. Serena would come to visit me, her shoulders heavy with silent exhaustion, carrying the subtle emotional bruises of a marriage built on constant, exhausting critique. Aaron made a habit of sighing loudly at the breakfast table, complaining to my daughter that managing a household while dealing with an aging mother who spends her days pottering around with old books and garden dirt was an unnecessary drag on his rising social standing. He talked about me as if I were an antique piece of furniture he had inherited by marriage, something to be tolerated, hidden away, or apologized for whenever important guests came over. He He treated my simple existence as an ongoing tax on his ego. Yet, the definitive proof of who he truly was came 4 months ago, echoing down a brightly lit, empty corridor at the Vanguard corporate headquarters. I had stopped by his office unannounced to drop off some legal paperwork Serena had left behind on the kitchen counter. As I walked past the open glass partition of the executive conference room, I heard Aaron's voice cutting sharply through the air, speaking casually to his chief operating officer. The old woman is completely past her prime. She just putters around her yard messing with rose bushes and old paperbacks. Having Serena constantly worrying over her is becoming a nuisance I simply don't have time to manage. I stopped walking. I stood entirely still in the quiet hallway, listening to the casual cruelty of a man who thought the ladder he climbed would never break beneath him. I didn't storm into the room, I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't confront him that day. I simply remembered an old adage my late husband used to repeat during our hardest decades in the corporate trenches. The river never stops to argue with a stone. It simply flows forward, and in time, the stone wears itself away completely to dust. Let them build their castles out of sand, because the tide always turns when you least expect it. Every word he spoke that day was a brick building the wall of his own eventual undoing. He never suspected that the empire he served was mine to give or to strip away at a moment's notice. And as I stood there in that hallway, watching him laugh with his COO, I knew his countdown had officially begun.
The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock, smelling faintly of imported lavender and old money. Gerald and Margaret Cross were hosting a family gathering at their sprawling estate in Westfield, a gated sanctuary of manicured hedges and wrought iron gates that loomed like a fortress against the rest of the world. Margaret made sure to mention it was a strict dress code affair, though the reminder didn't come from her directly. It came through Aaron, his voice dripping with that familiar, cautious irritation over the phone line. "Mom, please," he had sighed, as if explaining basic mathematics to a slow-witted child. "Just dress sharp. Try to look like you belong in Westfield for once. Leave the faded cardigans at home. Margaret hates looking at anything that smells like thrift stores." I didn't argue. I never argued with Aaron anymore. It only wasted breath. Instead, I bypassed the designer boutiques entirely. When the evening of the gala arrived, I drove my 10-year-old dust-covered Volvo right up the pristine cobblestone driveway of the Cross estate. The valet, a young man in a crisp charcoal uniform who looked barely old enough to shave, blinked in genuine confusion when he saw the dented bumper. I stepped out wearing the simplest, most unassuming linen dress I owned, clean, modest, entirely devoid of labels or pretension. I handed him the keys with a calm, unhurried smile. "Careful with her," I murmured softly. "She has character." The interior of the mansion was a master class in intimidation by interior design. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from vaulted ceilings, casting glittering cold light across marble floors that reflected every movement. Margaret intercepted me near the grand staircase, her smile stretched tight and plastic across her face like a fresh coat of paint. "Oh, Martha, sweetie," she cooed, her voice carrying that distinct, patronizing lilt she reserved for hospital volunteers and stray pets. "You made it, and you look, well, you look so sweet, so delightfully vintage." In Margaret's dictionary, the word sweet was never a compliment. It was a polite cage. It was her favorite weapon to dismiss anyone older, slower, or poorer than her as completely harmless and fundamentally irrelevant. Inside the cavernous dining hall, Gerald and Aaron were already deep into their performance. Long before the soup was served, the men were holding court at the head of the mahogany table, their voices echoing off the walls as they bragged about Vanguard logistics. They spoke of leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, and phantom liquidity numbers that existed only in PowerPoint presentations and fever dreams of infinite growth. Aaron's hands gestured wildly in the air, his fingers trembling ever so slightly with the manic energy of a man who had bet everything on a horse that was already limping. Gerald nodded along, stroking his silver-trimmed beard with the self-satisfied air of an aging king whose throne was built on sand. I sat quietly near the corner of the table, entirely silent. I didn't interrupt, I didn't posture, and I didn't try to match their roaring financial jargon. I simply unfolded my linen napkin, picked up my silver fork, and savored the chilled asparagus soup. But while my mouth tasted the subtle hint of truffle oil, my eyes were doing the real work. I watched the micro-expressions. I watched Aaron's left eye twitch whenever Gerald questioned a quarterly margin. I watched Margaret's cold, calculating eyes dart between her son and her husband, measuring human dignity strictly in square footage and jewelry brands. They were so busy performing their own power that they completely forgot to notice the person sitting quietly in the shadows. The tension in the room shifted only after the dessert plates were cleared away. The servants vanished silently into the shadows, leaving behind the soft amber glow of the candlelight. Gerald cleared his throat, a calculated, theatrical sound. With a slow, deliberate slide across the polished wood, he pushed a sleek black leather folder toward my side of the table. "Let's cut to the chase, Martha," Gerald said, his voice dropping an octave into that practiced boardroom baritone. "We're ready to take the next big step. We're launching an independent subsidiary specifically for Aaron. Total autonomy, clean slate." I didn't touch the folder yet. "That sounds ambitious," I replied, my tone flat, smooth, and utterly unreadable. "And the capital? Where does a venture of that magnitude find its backing?" Aaron leaned forward, his breathing shallow, unable to contain his excitement any longer. "We need a primary liquidity anchor, Mom, something substantial, zero-risk collateral to secure the institutional lines of credit." Gerald opened the leather folder just enough to reveal the crisp white pages inside, anchoring the bottom edge with his heavy signet ring. "We've structured it cleanly. All of Serena's remaining inheritance trust, combined with the unencumbered deeds to her primary real estate holdings, will serve as the collateral baseline. It's a mere formality, really, a formality to unlock millions." They wanted it all. They wanted to strip my granddaughter of her safety net, her future, and her family's land to fund Aaron's reckless corporate vanity project, turning her into the ultimate financial hostage for a sinking ship. The silence in the room grew heavy, pregnant with their arrogant expectation of immediate compliance. They expected me to nod, fold, and sign away a young girl's entire life just to be a part of their grand elite club. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out. My fingers brushed the black leather. I picked up the folder, lifting it under the warm, flickering candlelight, and began to turn the pages one by one. I read every clause, every subclause, and every hidden liability printed in microscopic font at the bottom of the page, taking my time while my former family held their breath in absolute breathless anticipation. Finally, I closed the folder with a soft, definitive thud. I looked up, met Gerald's expectant stare, and offered a warm, utterly placid smile. "Thank you for sharing the family's grand vision," I said softly, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "I'll think about this very, very carefully." The 14-day silence after the Westfield dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. While Aaron and his family sat comfortably in their grand estate waiting for a signature, I went right back to my quiet, unassuming daily routine. I watered my rose bushes every single morning at sunrise, brewed loose-leaf black tea every afternoon, and spent an hour chatting across the garden fence with my retired neighbor about the unpredictable local weather. My phone buzzed persistently throughout the days with text messages from Aaron, each one growing progressively more desperate, demanding, and transparently transactional as the deadline approached. "Have you looked over the agreement yet, Martha?" His messages read, dripping with thinly veiled urgency and irritation. "Everything is ready to roll out at the bank, and we are just waiting on Serena's signature to finalize the subsidiary." I read them on the screen, locked my phone, and set it face down on the kitchen counter without replying a single word. They assumed my silence meant hesitation or compliance. They had no idea it was the calm right before the industrial storm. The legal machinery had already been put into motion the very morning after that dinner party. At 8 o'clock sharp, without wasting a single second, I placed a secure, encrypted call to the managing partners of the Nexus Serena Trust, my primary legal counsel. For years, curious listeners and casual observers often wondered how Serena's vast fortune, family assets, and real estate holdings remained entirely untouchable, safely sheltered from the predatory tides of corporate marriages and opportunistic spouses. The answer lay in a binding legal framework I established a decade prior, the Irrevocable Family Protection Clause. Under federal trust laws and corporate governance standards, Serena's assets were legally classified as absolute separate property. They were meticulously firewalled, completely immune to any form of marital encumbrance, debt pooling, or collateralization, unless accompanied by the direct, notarized signature of the original trust founder, which happened to be me. Neither Serena nor any future spouse possessed the legal jurisdiction to pledge those assets as backing for an outside commercial venture. The vault door was double-locked, and I held the only two keys in existence. While my lawyers quietly reviewed the ironclad clauses, Aaron was walking straight into his own meticulously engineered trap. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after the Westfield dinner. Armed with a thick portfolio containing the paperwork Serena had reluctantly signed under months of relentless domestic pressure, assuring her it was just a routine administrative formality, Aaron and his father marched into the high-rise downtown branch of the city's largest commercial bank. They strode up to the VIP lending desk with the swagger of men who believed they had already secured their financial dynasty. Aaron slid the leather-bound folder across the polished marble counter, looking up at the senior branch director with a confident, victorious grin. "We are ready to draw down the initial tranche for our logistics subsidiary," Aaron announced smoothly, tapping the signature page with his pen. "We have the collateral secured through my wife's primary estate holdings." The branch director, a sharp-eyed veteran named David Vance, who had quietly managed high-tier portfolios for the Nexus network for over 20 years, slowly opened the folder. He didn't rush. He slipped on his glasses, meticulously reviewed the primary deed numbers, and checked the underlying trust identifiers against the Federal Registry database displayed on his dual computer monitors. The heavy silence stretched across the marble lobby for nearly a full minute, thick with anticipation, ambient tension, and growing dread. David closed the folder with a soft, deliberate click, removed his glasses, and looked up at Aaron with an expression of absolute, chilling professional indifference. "I am afraid this collateral agreement is legally void under federal trust protections. These property titles and trust funds are classified as absolute separate property. They are entirely immune to marital encumbrance, and under Section 4 of the Master Charter, they cannot be pledged as loan collateral without the explicit, verified authorization of the primary trust founder." Aaron's confident smile instantly froze, fracturing into sheer panic. He gripped the edge of the marble counter, his knuckles turning stark white. "That is impossible," Aaron stammered, his voice cracking slightly as the reality broke through his veneer. "Your wife is a beneficiary, Mr. Cross, not the founder," David replied coldly, sliding the leather folder back across the counter. "Without the founder's direct seal and signature, this contract is nothing more than expensive paper. You cannot borrow against an empire you do not own." Aaron stood frozen at the counter, completely paralyzed as the stark truth washed over him. The financial life jacket he thought would save his sinking career was nothing more than a solid wall of structural steel. He had spent 3 years climbing a corporate ladder that led straight off the edge of a cliff, and now the ground was finally disappearing completely beneath his feet, without leaving a single trace behind. Every heartbeat in that silent lobby echoed the inevitable truth. You can never outsmart a trap you built for yourself while underestimating the person who laid the foundation. And as he stared blankly at the closed folder, he finally understood the true weight of the silence he had so foolishly ignored. The financial trap at the commercial bank was only the very first domino to fall in a meticulously calculated sequence. While Aaron and his family were still reeling from the shocking realization that their fraudulent loan was completely dead on arrival, the real heavy industrial machinery of the parent corporation was already moving relentlessly behind the scenes to dismantle every single illusion they had so carefully constructed around their future success. The exact same morning David Vance locked out their paperwork at the bank, I picked up my encrypted desk phone and placed a direct, high-priority call to the senior auditing partners at Nexus, our parent conglomerate, bypassing all standard bureaucratic channels to launch the final phase. Initiate a Tier 1 special audit on Vanguard Logistics immediately, I instructed, my voice entirely level, cold, and completely devoid of emotion. Every subsidiary ledger, every internal communication channel, every vendor invoice, and every server log from the past 12 months. Leave nothing unexamined. For a major corporation like Vanguard, a Tier 1 audit is never a routine check. It is an industrial-grade earthquake that leaves no place to hide and no corporate shield intact. Exactly 10 days later, the final investigative dossier landed squarely on my mahogany desk in my home office. It was a comprehensive 40-page report bound in heavy, dark navy cardstock, detailing a systematic corporate betrayal executed with staggering arrogance and greed. For the past 8 months, Aaron had been quietly running a shadow operation right underneath the corporation's nose, believing his position as CEO rendered him entirely untouchable. He had systematically diverted Vanguard's proprietary client databases, misused corporate logistics facilities, and funneled company-paid engineering hours into building an independent competing startup designed to siphon away our core market share. It was a brazen, textbook violation of the strict fiduciary duty and non-compete clauses he had signed and initialed with his own hand when he first took the CEO seat 3 years prior. Every single transaction was meticulously documented, with timestamps, server logs, and wire transfers. He hadn't just tried to borrow against our family trust, he had been looting the mothership from the inside out while smiling directly in my face during family dinners. The ultimate reckoning arrived on a crisp, overcast Thursday morning, bringing with it the final chapter of his corporate delusion. I dressed with deliberate, uncompromising precision. I slipped into a tailored black power suit, draped a classic cashmere wool coat over my shoulders, and stepped out of my car right in front of the soaring glass and steel skyscraper that housed the Vanguard Logistics headquarters. The security guards at the front lobby immediately straightened their posture, lowering their gazes and nodding respectfully as I walked past the turnstiles without breaking a single stride. The private executive elevator carried me in absolute silence straight up to the top floor, bypassing the general corporate bullpen entirely and heading directly toward the inner sanctum of power, where destiny awaited. I walked straight toward the Grand Executive Boardroom, a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the sprawling downtown skyline. Inside, Aaron was pacing the length of the polished walnut table, surrounded by a couple of junior vice presidents and a jittery corporate lawyer. They were whispering excitedly, setting up projection screens and tactical briefs, preparing for what Aaron believed was going to be a major strategic planning session to launch his independent subsidiary now that he assumed the banking hiccup was safely behind him. The heavy oak doors swung open wide, without a warning or a knock, cutting cleanly through the ambient hum of the morning air. The room went instantly dead silent. Aaron turned around with a bright, confident smirk on his face, expecting to see a late investor or a regional partner arriving for his coronation. When he saw it was me standing alone in the doorway, his smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of sharp annoyance. "Martha, this is a closed-door executive session. How did you even get past security up here? We're in the middle of critical corporate restructuring." I didn't answer right away. I pulled off my leather gloves with slow, deliberate care, laid them across the edge of the conference table, and looked him straight in the eye with absolute calm. "You don't need to worry about restructuring, Aaron. We're here today to discuss liquidation, starting with your immediate termination." The blood drained completely from Aaron's face, leaving him standing frozen at the head of the table, in paralyzed disbelief, while the suffocating silence of the room swallowed his entire empire whole. Looking around the magnificent glass-walled room, I watched as the junior executives slowly slid their chairs backward, desperately distancing themselves from a man whose entire career had just evaporated into thin air. They realized instantly that being associated with Aaron's clandestine shadow operation meant instant professional suicide. The corporate lawyer sitting beside him hastily gathered his legal pads, zipped up his leather briefcase, and lowered his head, refusing to meet Aaron's panicked, pleading gaze. In the span of a single heartbeat, all the loyal allies and sycophants who had cheered for his corporate ascension vanished into the cold air of self-preservation. They understood as clearly as I did that any empire built on deceit and betrayal will always collapse from within, leaving behind nothing but the hollow ruins of unchecked human greed, profound arrogance, and inevitable legal accountability. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand boardroom closed behind me with a solid, absolute thud that seemed to echo through the very bones of everyone trapped inside the high-rise tower. But the real storm wasn't in the sound of the doors closing. It was in the suffocating, freezing silence that instantly filled the room, heavy with the unmistakable scent of impending doom and absolute corporate justice. Aaron pushed his way into the chamber with that exact same familiar, lazy smirk plastered across his face, the infuriating expression of a man who still believed he was the smartest person in any room he stepped into. He expected to walk into a friendly planning session with a few regional underlings to map out his bright, independent future. Instead, he walked right into an absolute execution chamber designed specifically to dismantle his entire existence down to the studs. Seated in a sharp, unbroken semicircle around the long conference table were not local managers, but the heavy-hitting members of the Supreme Board of Directors, alongside senior federal corporate attorneys and compliance officers. And sitting right at the center, in the high-backed leather chair reserved exclusively for the supreme seat of power, was the woman his boundless arrogance had spent years dismissing as a quiet, provincial mother-in-law from the countryside who knew nothing of the corporate world. For a single, jarring second, Aaron's stride completely broke. The smirk froze on his lips, twisting into an awkward, bewildered grimace as his eyes darted from the federal prosecutors to the cold, unblinking gaze fixed upon him from the head of the table. I didn't yell, I didn't slam my hands on the polished wood, and I didn't raise my voice by a single decibel. Anger is loud, and anger is for people who still feel like they need to prove something. I had nothing left to prove. With slow, deliberate precision, I reached out, untied the dark navy ribbon binding the 40-page forensic audit, and slid the dossier straight across the gleaming tabletop until it stopped right in front of his trembling hands. "Read it, Aaron," I said quietly, the stillness in my tone cutting sharper than any blade. He didn't want to touch it, but the weight of 10 federal subpoenas hanging in the air forced his fingers to open the cover. His eyes raced across the pages, skimming through the undeniable proof of his corporate sabotage, the hidden server logs, the unauthorized client data transfers, and the shell companies he had meticulously set up to siphon millions away from Vanguard Logistics over the past 8 months. The color drained from his face in violent, sickening waves. First, a rush of desperate, defensive crimson flooded his cheeks, burning hot with the humiliation of being caught red-handed in front of the most powerful corporate leaders in the country. Then, as the true scale of his ruin sunk into his bones, that flush evaporated entirely, leaving his skin the color of wet chalk. In that terrifying, silent snapshot in time, Aaron finally understood the cruel, inescapable truth. His entire career, his pristine CEO facade, his luxury apartments, his international trips to Geneva, and his hollow social status had never belonged to him. They had always existed entirely at the mercy of the woman sitting right in front of him. He was nothing more than a puppet whose strings had finally been cut by the master hand. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 12 floors below. Every eye was locked on him, waiting for the inevitable collapse of a man built entirely on glass and lies. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands flat on the polished wood of the mahogany table, and let my voice settle over the room with a calm, terrifying weight that reached straight into the marrow of his bones. You measure a person's worth by their bank accounts, their quarterly bonuses, and their corporate titles, Aaron. I measure a person's character by how they stand when every single illusion is stripped away. You failed that test the very first day you walked through my front door. He opened his mouth to speak, to stammer out a defense, an excuse, a threat, or a plea for mercy, but no sound came out. His lips simply parted, trembling in total defeat as the reality of his prison sentence stared him directly in the face. There was no trial, no public spectacle in a crowded courtroom, and no dramatic media circus. The corporate machinery doesn't waste time on public humiliation when quiet destruction is far more efficient. Pushed to the absolute edge with federal indictment looming as his only alternative, Aaron didn't have a choice left to make. With a shaking hand and a pen that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, he signed his immediate resignation letter right there on the spot, trading his freedom from criminal prosecution for total, permanent professional erasure. When he finally stood up to leave, he didn't look like a successful corporate executive anymore. He looked like an empty shadow, his shoulders caved inward, shuffling towards the exit without a single person in the room bothering to look up as he walked out of our lives forever, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding echo of his own catastrophic downfall and the absolute confirmation that every single consequence he faced was entirely of his own making. The heavy glass doors of the Vanguard Logistics skyscraper faded into the rearview mirror as I shifted my old, reliable Volvo into gear and pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the steady flow of evening traffic. The engine gave its familiar, gentle sputter, and the worn tires hummed softly against the asphalt as I left the high-rise towers, the flashing cameras, and the shark-infested corporate world far behind me. No financial journalists would ever print my name on the morning front pages, and no tech blogs would write breathless op-eds detailing the quiet takeover that had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud in under an hour. To the rest of the world, it was just an ordinary Thursday evening commute filled with rushing cars and tired commuters heading home after a long day at the office. To me, it was simply the final, necessary chapter of a cleanup that had been a long time coming, closing a heavy door on a chapter of deceit without a single headline or public applause. I drove down the familiar, winding stretch of Elmwood Drive, watching the neighborhood streetlights flicker on one by one beneath the sprawling canopy of ancient oak trees. The gentle breeze rustled through the branches, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth and late summer blooming flowers from the nearby gardens. By the time I pulled my car into the gravel driveway and turned off the ignition, the profound silence of the evening settled over the vehicle like a warm, protective blanket, washing away the lingering chill of the downtown boardroom and the heavy pressures of the day. 20 minutes later, the front door swung open with a breathless, hurried click. Serena stood in the entryway, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wide and swimming with unshed tears of absolute shock and disbelief. She had just rushed over straight from her office after receiving an emergency courier package from the family trust attorneys. The legal notices were completely unambiguous. Her personal assets, her independent accounts, and her future were entirely walled off and protected from Aaron's catastrophic wreckage, completely shielded by the ironclad legal structures I had quietly put in place months prior to protect her from his greed. Attached to the portfolio was a secondary set of papers, an expedited unilateral divorce petition already signed by Aaron in a state of absolute frantic panic, forfeiting every single claim to our family wealth just to escape the looming shadow of federal prison cells and public disgrace. She walked into the kitchen like someone waking up from a multi-year fever dream, dropping her keys on the counter with a heavy, trembling clatter that echoed softly in the quiet, empty house, looking around as if she were seeing it for the first time. We didn't turn on the harsh overhead lights. Instead, we sat down together at the scarred wooden kitchen table where we had shared countless quiet breakfasts and long conversations over the years. 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea sat between us, casting fragile, curling ribbons of white steam into the cool evening air. The house was wrapped in a profound, settling peace, completely isolated from the venomous ambition and the glass and steel coldness that had defined Aaron's entire miserable existence. Serena reached across the wood, her fingers locking tightly around mine, her hands shaking as the sheer emotional weight of the betrayal and the sudden rescue finally caught up to her voice. "Mom, why did you take all of his cruelty and disrespect for so long? Why didn't you ever tell me the truth about who you really were before today?" I looked at her, watching the fierce, raw honesty breaking through the remnants of her heartbreak, and offered her a soft, understanding smile. I didn't rush to answer, letting the quiet warmth of the tea ground us both in the present moment, far away from the noise of the city, watching the steam curl upward toward the ceiling. "Because I wanted you to choose your life with your own free heart, Serena, not because of the shadow of a family fortune. A woman's true power has never belonged to the glitter of wealth or social titles. It lives entirely in her quiet resilience, her inner wisdom, and her unconditional love." She looked back at me, and in that single, profound glance, the last remaining shackles of her past slipped away forever, replaced by a fierce and grounded clarity that no amount of money could ever buy or manufacture. Sitting there together under the soft golden glow of the kitchen lamp, looking out through the window at the quiet garden where the late summer roses bloomed silently under the fading sunset, I felt a deep, unshakable peace settle into my bones. The wolves of the financial world had retreated back to the dark corners where they belonged, leaving behind a hard-earned reminder that no matter how loud arrogance can roar, genuine character, quiet dignity, and unyielding patience will always have the final, lasting word as life gently moves forward into a bright, peaceful new dawn. The story closes not with a roar, but with an enduring, quiet smile of absolute self-respect and grace that no storm could ever shatter, leaving an everlasting impression on anyone who has ever doubted the quiet power of a mother's resilient heart, proving once and for all that true victory belongs to those who stand in truth when the noise finally fades completely.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today,
and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.